So wonderful. We have participants joining us from the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, New York, North Dakota, Texas, Moldova, Kansas, South Dakota. That's my home state, South Dakota. Grand Forks, North Dakota, Maine. All right, I think that we can go ahead and begin. My name is Laura Wilson. I'm an attorney with Global Rights for Women. And we're so excited that you've all joined us today to talk about this really timely and important topic, adapting response to sexual violence during COVID-19. This webinar is part of a series that Global Rights for Women has been hosting since the beginning of April on adapting systems response to violence against women and girls. And this is the first webinar that we've had specifically focusing on sexual violence. We have a wonderful group of panelists today, a multidisciplinary panel, so we're really excited to hear from them very soon. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Nazifa Wazirzada, to talk a little bit about the logistics for today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura. Just to start off with the logistics, hello everyone. I am Nazifa, the program coordinator here at Global Rights for Women, and feel free to type your questions or comments into the chat box throughout the entirety of the webinar, and moderators will be passing along those questions to the panelists throughout the presentation. And just as a reminder, a recording will be sent to all of you, so you may view it afterwards. And look out for CLE accreditation because that will be applied for Minnesota.
For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, Global Rights for Women is a nonprofit organization based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we work around the world with partners to advance women and girls' human right to live free from violence. And we focus on legal reform and institutional and social change. So, you know, in our discussion today, we're really interested in hearing from our panelists about the systemic change work that they've done in the past and that they're now adapting to COVID-19. If you can go to the next slide, Nazifa. So today we're really excited, Nazifa and I, to have Laura Williams joining us as a moderator. Laura, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Apologies, the unmute button. Thanks for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. I've been working in addressing sexual violence and our response since the late 1980s, and have done a few things in my career, including some work with multidisciplinary responses as well and system change. So I'm really pleased to be here and appreciate the invitation from Global Rights for Women to work on this panel presentation. Today I consult and work with leaders who are searching for innovative responses and finding our way through complexity to wise action. So I'll turn it back to you, Laura. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you. So, and now we're going to have our panelists introduce themselves. As I said before, we're really excited to have a multidisciplinary panel today, folks that can really speak to the practices that they're developing in different fields and also to kind of the coordination between different fields around sexual violence. So I'm going to start by having Sandie Barton introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Sandie Barton. I'm from Rape Crisis Scotland. We're the national organisation in Scotland working on sexual violence. We work in partnership with the 17 rape crisis centres across the country. We run a number of national projects, including prevention work, working with young people around preventing sexual violence, as well as national advocacy projects. We do a lot of campaigning and looking at change, not only for the individuals and communities, but thinking about whole organisational approaches, as well as a sort of legislative context and the whole wider community context in terms of rape culture.
Thank you, Sandie. And Steve Bellshaw.
Good morning. My name is Steve Bellshaw. I'm the Deputy Chief of Police here for Salem, Oregon Police Department. We're the capital city of the state of Oregon. I have been a police officer for over 30 years now. Most of that has been in investigations of domestic violence, sexual assault, and things like that. I also serve as a trainer for our Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force and as a consultant for the International Association of Chiefs of Police and their Violence Against Women Leadership Institute.
Thank you. Jessie Mindlin.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. This is Jessie Mindlin, and I'm in Portland, Oregon this morning. I wear kind of a couple of different hats. I direct the Portland-based office of a nonprofit or NGO called the Victim Rights Law Center. And I often say our name's a bit of a misnomer because we focus exclusively on issues of rape and sexual assault. And we provide free legal services to survivors. And then we also do a lot of national training, mentoring, consulting, teaching, individual and programmatic case consultation. And then I personally do a little bit of work overseas as well. And I'm delighted to be here. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. And Sara Jennings.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're at. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Sara Jennings. I'm the Education Director for the International Association of Forensic Nurses. I'm also a forensic nurse, or as some may still commonly refer to as a sexual assault nurse examiner. Our organization is a membership organization that looks at expanding the outreach of forensic nursing and combating violence. We educate our membership, we educate our community partners, and we do provide technical assistance also.
Thank you. Okay, Nazifa, could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, before we jump into our discussion with panelists, we want to talk, set the tone a little bit with some points around framing. So what are we thinking about, or what do we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about sexual violence and about adapting our response during COVID-19? So one point that kind of came up in our preparation and that we want to emphasize is that we understand that context matters. It looks like we have people joining us from all over the world, from all over the country. And we know that, you know, dynamics are different in every community. And also the legal framework is different, the policies, the resources that are available. And so what we're providing today are examples of practices that our panelists have found useful. We hope that you'll also offer your insights in the chat box and through your questions to panelists. We know we don't have all the answers, and that's not what we're providing today, but we're hoping for a really rich discussion. We also want to, you know, acknowledge, and Laura Williams will be talking about this a little bit more, that sexual violence is both a personal violation and also a tool of enforcing power, privilege, and oppression. And that, you know, we need to be thinking about this as a systemic issue, and panelists will be discussing that today, both how they work with survivors during this time and what are their practices on an individual level, but also what are kind of the policies and the systems change issues that we need to be thinking about. Nazifa, can you move to the next slide, please? And one of the you know, when we talk about systemic reform, one of the important things to keep in mind that we kind of want all of our panelists and our participants to be thinking about today is also keeping our eye and our minds and our hearts on intersectional oppression. Many of you know that, and I think I just mentioned that Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And our home community has been really shaken to the core in the last couple of months by the recent murder of George Floyd by police. It's really deepened our community's attention to the ways that institutional racism pervades our systems, and including systems that are intended to prevent and respond to violence. And so we know this is a familiar experience to communities around the world. And we just have been talking, you know, amongst ourselves about the need to center intersectional oppression in our understanding of the need for institutional change when we're talking about creating victim-centered responses. So our panelists are going to be, you know, speaking about those issues today as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura Williams now, and I'm going to be hiding my camera and monitoring the chat. So please feel free to communicate with me there. And Laura, please go ahead and take it from here.
Thanks, Laura. So one of the things we think about when we talk about sexual violence is there's actually many, many forms of sexual violence. And I know a number of you probably have a lot of experience with domestic violence. There's certainly the sexual violence that comes up in intimate partner relationships as a tool of control and power and additional trauma. There are a bunch of other forms though as well, right? There's a whole range of forms, everything from exposing to intimidating sexual harassment to rape and sexual assault. There's a whole continuum. Those of us who work in sexual violence also often work with a whole range of ages. Sometimes people focus primarily on adult survivors. Many focus on teen survivors as well. Our systems in the US particularly bifurcate at child sexual abuse survivors and victims in terms of response agencies, but oftentimes advocacy programs will respond and support the whole range. So we won't be delving a lot into all those different forms, but I do want to invite you to keep in mind that there are a range of forms of sexual violence, perpetrators known to the victim, unknown to the victim, contexts vary dramatically. At the core, of course, is that it's a non-consensual act. It was coercive, non-consensual, and even use of force. So I think I'll leave it at that, but then invite panelists if they see that there are ways that their systems have adapted, in particular in some forms of sexual violence versus others, or ways that there are gaps, feel free to call that out. I just wanted to bring that into our space. All right, Nazifa, you can move on. So today's conversation will be about reaching survivors, particularly from the start of the pandemic, and thinking about how our systems have been able to continue some things in some cases and just try and get the word out, and in other cases have needed to adapt. And we'll check in from time to time with your questions as participants and what the chat is. We have some spotlight issues that we'll be able to reference either in combination with that discussion in the chat, or I'll bring those forth for us to talk about. And we'll also be considering some policy issues as they arise throughout the presentations. And then end on kind of what's next as some transitioning is happening here in the US and maybe where you are around the world as well. What kinds of issues are on your mind, the thorny, sticky ones maybe that we should all be paying attention to, and our panelists as well. So with that, I think we'll just hide the slides for now so we can just have a good conversation. And I'd like to start with you, Sandie. At Rape Crisis Scotland, your agency runs a national hotline for survivors and hosts meetings with local rape crisis programs all around Scotland, at least 16 or more. Can you talk about the early mobilizing you and your agencies did to keep those services available to survivors, both nationally and in those local communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think like everybody, we had to make very rapid changes, you know, sometimes overnight. So some of the things that were on my sort of work plan for next 6 months, you know, it's like, let's make it happen by next Friday. So I think for the national helpline, for example, we stood down all the volunteers, and there was a very quick response from the Scottish Government, coordinating with all of the violence against women organisations around what their needs were to transition over to remote working. There's sort of weekly coordination meetings with the Scottish Government, so we were able to access additional funds. That meant that centres were able to move from providing face-to-face support to remote support. And I think right from the very start, one of the key considerations is not only the safety for survivors, but the safety for workers in terms of the potential impact of vicarious trauma when you're suddenly bringing trauma into your home. So I think there's a lot of attending to the kind of ongoing well-being of workers in what is really uncharted territory. So we were able to transition that, and I think there's been a very rapid adaptation of new technologies. So moving to web chat, I mean, one of the key things survivors are saying is that they don't have, a lot of the time, they don't have the privacy. So having the space to be able to speak on the phone where that might have been their usual form of communication. So looking at web chat, people adapting text, that sort of thing. And our sort of coordination with the network. We've got a sort of online forum where people are sharing resources, so we're not having to reinvent the wheel, I think, in terms of thinking about maximum privacy, confidentiality, and also sort of innovation, so building on the work of others. I think one of the things that we already had in place, which has been really helpful, is we have a protocol with Police Scotland, so it's a national police force for the country. And if anyone experiences a serious sexual crime, they're referred through to the national helpline, not only in terms of access and support, but one of the key elements is that there is a feedback protocol, so that we're asking survivors, how did it go with the police? Were there any concerns, any issues, anything that could have been done better or differently? And it applies not only to their experience with the police, but their experience with forensic services. And it allows survivors a voice, which is really crucial, but it also means that we can any early identification of any difficulties, and that we're able to flag that up on a kind of advocacy basis, either where individuals are saying, look, I want something done in this particular case, or even if it's just for future learning. So I think having those formal processes in place allowed us to very quickly identify where there were difficulties. So I know we're going to hear about forensic services, but allowed us to identify quickly where things weren't in place that should have been. So that was really helpful. I suppose one of the key issues that also comes up is around digital exclusion. You're therefore relying much more on devices, people being able to access support remotely. So we've been able to, through some of our collaborative work with one of the big mobile phone providers, access free phones, free data, unlimited calls, which we've been able to give out to survivors who are particularly excluded. Because I think what we're seeing, and I know other countries are also seeing that, is that sort of heightened inequality, gendered inequality, that kind of intersectional inequality. And I think obviously you mentioned particularly some of the recent focus on what needs to be done better and differently in terms of how we engage with different groups of survivors. People talk about hard to reach sometimes, or easy to ignore, I think, where you have survivors who have even less of a voice. So there's been a lot of attention to that. I think technology also offers some of the sort of opportunities as well. So one of the things that we've seen quite a heightened increase in is stalking. So where people know where their victims are going to be. So we are working with the Scottish Women's Rights Centre in the rolling out of the Follow It app, which is an app which helps people record instances of stalking, which in and of themselves might not be criminal behaviours. So building up that picture of a course of conduct, it's a collaborative development that we did with survivors and with the police and the Crown Office and the Prosecution Service in Scotland. So that's seen a big increase in demand, I think, over the last wee while. So I think whilst there are challenges with technology, there's definitely opportunities as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I heard so many things in that, right? The previous coordination that you had between the Crown and advocacy and organizations served you well then when you moved into this, right? You had those relationships in place and were able to start really talking about how are we adapting and moving to quick updates, the need to check in real repeatedly, as well as, like you said, starting to figure out, hopefully with partners in business, right? The donation of data and mobile phones. Certainly that issue of adapting our work as advocates and the privacy and technology on our end. I'll just mention there's some fantastic work in the US, toolkits both for survivors to understand how technology can be used, as well as advocates moving online. We'll send out links to all of that. So we won't go extremely in depth in that here. There may be other panelists who will talk some about it, but we'll also send that out. I'd like to ask, just before we move on, what kinds of, on your national hotline, what kinds of issues were you hearing from survivors as they would call in, particularly in the early days, and where that might be at now?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially there was the shock, as there was for everyone else, about what does this even mean. But I think what we've seen over the while, a number of things. One, the struggles for people who are on their own in terms of social isolation, particularly those who are shielding, you know, who are in high risk groups, the sort of social isolation, and also the vacuum. So things that people have managed to keep at bay over the years through the structure of their lives, their busy social and working lives, that void, suddenly people being overwhelmed with traumatic experiences from before. I think people's usual coping strategies are maybe not available. Their usual support networks, services have been reduced. And so people finding themselves feeling quite abandoned. We've definitely seen a heightening, I think, in terms of suicidal thoughts and feelings, and where maybe statutory services are having to really focus only on emergencies. I've certainly heard from A&E, sort of accident and emergency doctors, that often people are waiting until it's emergency before presenting, and it's worse than it might ordinarily be. I think the same goes in terms of mental health presentations, because people are quite fearful about accessing maybe health services. As well as, I mean, there's been a lot of focus, I think, on sort of domestic abuse and women being at home with perpetrators, but we're also hearing quite a lot from young people who are at home in either abusive or sometimes just unsupportive households. So I think being in that environment when you're there are challenges when you're on your own, but there are also significant challenges when you're around other people, even, you know, whether in terms of being in an abusive situation or even just having to maintain that level of face, which ordinarily you might not have to. And I think the sort of gendered nature of it, given that children are all home from school as well, about we're trying to balance and juggle multiple aspects, particularly, I mean, we've seen some of the early stats around the level of gendered burden that women are taking on in terms of trying to manage their children and their own lives and their own work. I think that is significant. So in terms of post-lockdown planning, there's definitely that sort of having that gendered lens and that intersectional lens, I think, will be really vital.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That brings up a lot of things in my mind, so we may come back to them. But I'd like to go now to Jessie. You provide consultation, training, and assistance on legal and policy issues with survivors, as you mentioned in your introduction, and they go well beyond the criminal legal system and that response. And so this might be a really good time to talk about the kinds of issues you and your colleagues have been seeing as you do your work with survivors and other professionals who call you for assistance.
Sure. In fact, I would say that the focus of our work at the Victim Rights Law Center is actually outside of the criminal justice system. I think one of our, foundational presentations is titled "Justice is More Than Jail," and really that taking a survivor-centered approach means what does justice look like for that survivor, and every survivor will define it differently. So our focus tends to be much more here in the U.S. what we refer to as sort of civil legal remedies. And that's much more in the realm of housing, employment, privacy, survivor safety, financial stability. We have a significant caseload working with both undocumented and legally present immigrant victims. And then also very significant client population or survivors coming to us asking for help with school-related sexual violence and sexual assault. Those numbers, I think, right now certainly have dropped just because, virtually every institution that was offering in-person classes sort of suspended them by the end of March. But there were a number of ongoing cases, and for those in the U.S. in particular, probably aware that there are a lot of changes that are being considered right now, or that have been, put forth by the federal administration with respect to how sexual harassment, including sexual assault and sexual violence, will be handled in our schools. So we've been doing a lot of work in that arena. But it's really had a very significant impact on the survivors that we serve, both in terms of our services and also the many other community partners and collaborators with whom we work. I know that in many different parts of the country, for example, advocates stopped providing first response when sexual assault survivors were going to hospitals for a medical forensic exam. And both in terms of advocate safety, survivor safety, and also because hospitals were dramatically limiting and curtailing who could come into their space. Was really being limited only to people who were patients. So I started going off a lot, Laura.
No, that's
from
fine.
That one question, but
no, that's exactly. We talked in some of our pre-session thinking about even just some of the specific ways that was playing out. I think a little bit related to what Sandie was talking about too, right? Mm-hmm. That some of the people who are calling in are, you know, maybe not in immediate danger from their family, but haven't disclosed to family members, or that's not where they get their primary support. And you're trying to help guide them a little bit about how to be safe online, but also sort of participate in the either campus adjudication processes or other processes as they sort of move on. So just curious as to those kinds of things that you might be seeing too that can help people, all of us, sort of imagine some of the dilemmas that survivors are facing as they're trying to come forward.
I mean, I think both for providers and for survivors, everything shifted, as Sandie said, virtually overnight. And it was really interesting and sort of affirming to hear you talk, Sandie, about all the privacy considerations and implications. You know, from the provider perspective, all of a sudden, literally every step of everything that we do, we needed to be examining and assessing from a survivor privacy perspective, and whether that was, where's the mail coming into, how are staff sending mail back out to survivors, right? You can't just put it in your outgoing mailbox with a survivor's name on it. Phones, how are the phones, whether it's a work phone or a personal phone that's now being used for work? What are people's settings? Are survivors' names coming up on the screen so that they might be visible to other household members, and that would not be acceptable? Or for staff who might be texting with a client, are there banners or notifications? Really trying to anticipate, you know, every single act associated with trying to serve survivors and protect their privacy. Printing out documents, what do you do with them after you've printed them out? There has to be a secure way of disposing or destroying or holding on to them. And then conversely, all of that was true for survivors as well. You know, we have particularly, I think I would say often, students who all of a sudden returned home and were living with their families, who may not have known anything about the victimization that survivor experienced. I think I mentioned earlier in one of our calls that, you know, we had a survivor who was talking to their attorney from a closet in their parents' home because they'd never told their parents that they had been sexually assaulted when they were at school, and wanted to maintain that privacy. And even, you know, when we call, or our clients sort of call us, they don't have the kind of options that they used to have before, right? If they were employed, or they lived with somebody who was employed, they might be leaving the house, or the other person might be leaving the house. Their kids would be in school if they were school age, so they would be able to have a conversation then in talking with an advocate or a lawyer or whomever, from whomever they were seeking services. And all of those options disappeared. A number of courts, for example, are now conducting hearings by telephone and also by video conference. And folks can probably tell, you know, I'm using a virtual background, and I'm doing that so that I have a little more privacy. I don't actually have a view like that behind me at my home. Oh, but that it were.
Yes.
You know, but courts are not thinking about survivor privacy and what does it mean to appear by video conferencing and who else might be on it. And it really is not only giving the judge or the trier of fact, but opposing counsel if there is one, and the defendant or respondent or whatever, however the term is that they're being referred to, and that depending on the posture of the case, a view of where's the survivor living and what does the inside of their home look like. Sandie mentioned the stalking. I mean, there's so much information that you can glean. And trying to prepare the survivors that we're working with to not only just respond, but to anticipate all of this. And similarly, it's great in many ways, you know, that courts gave the option of having survivors appear by phone or by video conference. But there are also some very challenging, if not disastrous, in my opinion, consequences that have flowed out of that. So for example, how do you communicate if your client or the survivor has one telephone and they're having to use that to testify and to, you know, sort of appear in court? Well, then how are you going to be communicating with that client during the hearing? And then of course, there are parts of the hearing where you may be speaking to your client, and there are times that you may not. So for example, if they're giving testimony, you can't be, you know, trying to text them. And you know, there's some things I think that we've come up with that might make it easier. For example, just providing a headset, right? If someone's on a headset, then they can be both speaking and looking at their phone and perhaps communicating that way. But you really have to, you know, anticipate and think ahead, and also be able to prepare your client. Lots of folks are using many different kinds of video conferencing, and so neither the providers nor the survivors are really familiar with that. And of course, that all of that relies, as Sandie mentioned as well, on internet and technology. And we have a huge digital divide in this country here in the United States, and we have survivors, particularly in rural areas, where there isn't any kind of high-speed internet. There may not be phone access at all. People may not have, you know, modern printers or computers, and yet so much right now of their access to services is resting on that. And for many months now, many of the places where they might have gone to traditionally to try and access services or access equipment are shut down. So community centers, public libraries, perhaps a job, none of those places may be accessible to them. So that has definitely had a dramatic impact on survivors' access to services. You know, we also, in this country, there is many jurisdictions of victim advocate or survivor advocate privilege, and virtually every jurisdiction has some form of attorney-client privilege. But all of those laws typically rest on the expectation and the requirement that the communication or the conversation be confidential. And so what does that look like when survivors don't have a confidential space? You know, sure, some might be living somewhere where there's an office or a bedroom that they can go into and close the door and have privacy, but that's not true for millions and millions of people. And how do we both maintain that client confidentiality for the emotional need as well as for evidentiary or legal needs? So those are some of the things that we're seeing. We have definitely seen the numbers of callers way down. So there's been a depression in the number of survivors who are reaching out for legal services. And I know that's true for a number of the domestic and sexual violence agencies as well. And I know that where I live in my state and also in many others, the numbers of the reports of child sexual abuse are down by anywhere between 50 to 80%, because so many of the adults and the professionals and providers with whom those children would be coming in contact, all those places have been suspended. And so both those sobering numbers of what's happening to those children in terms of physical or sexual abuse, and also how do we prepare ourselves that as we open up, I think we're just going to see a deluge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll be able to, that's come up a lot in our pre-conversation. I think some people on the chat are in mind with that too, and we'll want to come to that as we look forward sort of in a bit, kind of what strategies are emerging and how people are thinking about it. Before, that was fantastic, Jessie, lots of pieces to think about. And I know from our registration information that a lot of participants are really thinking about privacy and safety issues. I think this might be a good moment after both Sandie and Jessie just to check in with Laura and see what's maybe coming up with the chat. Are there questions that might be good to pose right now? I know some might be coming up when we talk with Sara and Steve, might be answered then, but can I turn to you, Laura?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And we do have a number of really great questions coming up, some of which I know panelists will be covering later in the discussion. But one that I think really connects with what both Sandie and Jessie discussed is this question from April Donovan, who asks, as a sexual assault victim advocate, many clients and survivors on my caseload have declined video assessments or appointments in fear of it being recorded. Any insights or suggestions to provide the survivor comfort and support while assuring them of privacy?
Well, I'm going to jump in with two thoughts. And the first is, the recording issue is, I think, huge and has really profound and in some ways very negative consequences for some survivors. I know there's one state here in the United States, in the interest of open court, that they are broadcasting all of the hearings on YouTube when a survivor goes to court to ask for a civil protection order for safety reasons. And can't be convinced, at least not yet, of the horror of that. So, in fear of being recorded, I mean, one of my sort of common phrases always is say what you do and do what you say. And I think to the extent that we can empower survivors by giving them information so that they can ask, is this being recorded? What will happen with that information? Do I have an option so that we can do it without it being recorded? And it really kind of depends on the context, but knowledge and information is power. So for me, that's always the starting place, is to find out what's happening and what are the options. And if someone says, I don't want it to be recorded, and whether that's going to another provider or finding out what your rights may be, whether it's as under the victim rights laws as a survivor of sexual assault, under the protocols for that agency. So it wasn't clear, and I don't know, April, if you want to just sort of clarify this, whether you're talking about a particular kind of assessment, because those assessments come up in so many different contexts. Are we talking law enforcement or courts or counseling? That just might help me have some different thoughts on it.
And Jessie, I also have a question about the example you gave. What state is doing that, the practice?
Texas.
Okay. Well, I wait to see if, so April says court and counseling.
Mm-hmm. So with the courts, I will say we're certainly helping providers to explore what their legal remedies are in terms of trying to have a case and a client to file a privacy objection and to offer different approaches. Sometimes it's a strategic approach. Who is is there a state court administrator? Is there a sympathetic presiding judge? What alternatives can you offer? So for example, that if somebody does want to participate in the hearing from the general public, that they have to pre-register and also sign an agreement that they themselves will not record the hearing, and that they won't redistribute it if it is being recorded. I mean, just trying to provide some limitations so that we are continuing to, for me, it's a matter of decency. But I think it has to be a multi-prong approach, and when one doesn't work, then you keep trying others. And it's a great place also where bringing in many different community partners and institutions to talk about how this will impact survivors' access to safety and the social implications of making survivors choose in that way. I think sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Could I just, you're saying about sort of counselling as well as sort of within a court setting. I suppose the other thing that I would say similarly, what the feedback we're getting from centres is that a lot of people, a lot of workers are feeling that they don't want the video because you've got a very good background. When I do it, my eyes disappear into the background. It's like quite terrifying, like nobody's going to want to sit in a room with that. But I think there is this sort of intrusion into your home with video in the way that there isn't with a phone. And I think one of the good things about going somewhere outside of your home where that's possible to do the support is that you can leave it behind there in a way that you can't with video. I think phone even, there is an element of you put it down and it's not in your home in the same way. But I think video for both parties, because some workers are saying, I'm not comfortable with the level of even just what's the background look like, where are you? You know, it is an intrusion into both people's lives in that same way. So I think for the majority of people who are accessing support, previously were accessing face-to-face, a significant proportion of them have paused it, have said that they don't want to do that until they can do it face-to-face, or have said, I'd rather do it over the phone because there's an element of control and limitation that minimises that sort of intrusion into their own home. And nobody wants that spilling over into their own home any more than it needs to be. So I think just that flexibility of however people want to do it, if it's text, if it's phone, if it's video, where we can offer that, the better, I think.
That's great, Sandie, thanks. I'd also note that there, we'll send out in the links, there's a pretty extensive webinar on sort of advocacy and telecounseling and all the considerations. You're speaking really well to them. That could be a session all on itself, right? To really get all those nuances and the options for practice. We'll send that out as well so that people who really want to go deep on thinking about the issues associated with that. And definitely what you're saying, some people just saying, look, it doesn't have to be on video. We can go back to the days when we were using a phone, right? So thanks for bringing that in. Laura, I think I might move on so that we can, is that make sense, or are there any other really pressing things for this particular day of the conversation?
Laura, we have a couple of other questions that I think will probably be addressed by the upcoming panelists, and if not, we can circle back. So
okay, perfect.
I've also been asked to turn on my video, so I'm going to do that.
Okay. Thank you. All right, great. Well, let's, Sara, I'd like to come to you next. Your international organization runs a helpline to support forensic nurses in applying best practices locally. And certainly it's already been raised a bit about the unique challenges, particularly because of the whole nature of the forensic medical exam and checking out survivors for their health and well-being, as well as gathering forensic information. So what themes were you hearing at early stages of the pandemic response as you had member agencies call in with their questions and challenges?
Sure, that's a great question. Early on, it was what many of you have mentioned. It was the rapid change of what do we do and how do we implement these changes very quickly. Many of our members are not what we would consider a full-time forensic nurse. So our membership is comprised of sexual assault nurse examiners, but many of them still do participate very actively or are employed full-time as either an emergency department nurse or an ICU nurse, or they may be a community nurse. So forensic nursing is not their full-time job. So when this pandemic began, many of those nurses were then pulled back to their full-time positions as a nurse, as opposed to caring for victims of violence. But in that same time period, we also saw a rapid decline in patients actually seeking care for the forensic perspective. So our membership was reporting that they were seeing declines in patients presenting to both the hospital setting and the community setting. And in that same time period, we were also seeing programs have staffing concerns of, I can't staff my program because I'm sending my nurses to care for frontline COVID patients. Also thrown in that, of course, was the concern of personal protective equipment from a medical perspective, which we also discussed in some of our advocacy phone calls that we had with responses of advocates coming into the hospital. The concern was that medical providers needed access to PPE, so we may not be able to provide that to advocates that were also coming in to be with the patients while they were there for their forensic exam. Many of our hospital programs that were still having advocates come in at that point did stop, and we're moving more toward tele-advocacy or other forms of either phone advocacy, which as an organization, we've done a lot of work with our advocacy partners working through that to make sure that both the advocacy piece and the medical piece were then meshed together very well, so we were meeting the patient holistically. Other things we saw really were very unique. We had nurses that didn't have childcare, which posed a very big concern for our membership of how do we access childcare so we can both care for frontline patients coming in with COVID, but also caring for victims of violence. So that was something we worked out with our membership as best we could based off of their location and what their needs were at that moment. We became very creative with suggestions of how to move your program. If you were an in-hospital forensic nursing program, how to move that out of the hospital and what that looked like. So would that be moving to a community practice? Would it be a physician's doctor's office? Was it somewhere else in the community that had the space available? Because really what we wanted communicated was back to our patients, back to the victims, that we were still there to provide care, and we were still there to provide anything from the evidentiary perspective if they needed evidence collected. We wanted them to know that we were still there and to continue that outreach so that they knew that service was available. It may not look like what it looked like prior to COVID, but we wanted to make sure that they knew that we were there and able to serve them.
That's excellent. You know, it occurs to me that we have some folks in our audience that may not really be familiar with what a forensic medical examiner does. Can you briefly just explain the overall role in the overall response?
Absolutely. So I talked briefly about a SANE, so sexual assault nurse examiner. We really have expanded past that as a forensic nurse examiner. So we're caring for all different types of victims of violence from birth to death, whether that be adult physical or sexual violence, child physical or sexual, intimate partner violence, elder abuse, human trafficking, strangulation. So anywhere where medicine and the legal system intersect is really where the forensic nurse is actively involved. We do a ton of community education so that we can have awareness within the community so patients know where to seek care. We also do a lot of education within hospital systems, with our community partners, law enforcement, other legal services. So we do a little bit of everything.
Right, I know, and you all have issued some fantastic guidance. We'll also send those out in the links, both around COVID-19 and patient care. There's also a piece about advocacy and that coordination. And I want you to speak, there was a question I think that I saw came up in the chat about creative ways when advocates can't go. And when I watched that, I realized that there were a few places that still had advocates coming in, and they took very specific steps, like only staff, not volunteers, taking temperatures, those kinds of things. But by and large, it seems that most suspended that for a while. And the conversation between the forensic medical examiner and the program and advocates had to get kind of creative. Can you speak to a few things that you're aware that people did to try and sort of continue to make that a coordinated and kind of humane experience for the survivor?
Absolutely. So like you mentioned, some places did maintain the same response that they had previously, and we were encouraging them to follow whatever the hospital, if they were in a hospital setting, policies and procedures, which meant that they would typically be screened, they would have their temperature taken, they would have to don appropriate personal protective equipment. But we wanted to make sure that while the patient was being served, we were really serving the advocate and making sure that they were being able to be protected and to stay as healthy as possible. While we all know that tele-advocacy at times is not the best approach, and we've talked about the video screen and how that makes the patient feel, and honestly, it's the experience of both the advocate and the patient, not just the patient. We want to make sure that that is beneficial for both parties. So we've had a lot of guidance and conversations around, are we meeting the patient where they are, and are we meeting the patient's needs the best we can? So that's a very guided conversation by the forensic nurse or the sexual assault nurse of, are you willing to do this? Is this something that you're comfortable with? When during the exam would this be most beneficial? So lots of conversations that historically may not have happened because we were going into this as a team approach together. But lots of conversations. We've encouraged the tele-advocacy from the perspective of sort of like a FaceTime, like a video of what we're doing right now, when it's okay, when it's a safe place, when it's comfortable for both the advocate and the patient. We've encouraged telephone advocacy when available also.
Yeah, I made special note of that. I think it was someone from the Ohio Sexual Assault Coalition that talked about sometimes being on the phone and even then having a conversation about, do you want me to stay on while you wait? Do you want me to call back and check in with you? These are all techniques to kind of sort out how to be present and yet, like you said, really fit what the patient is able to do and interested in.
And we found that the programs, so I still do some clinical work, and the programs that had hospital advocates that were already embedded within the hospital systems that were employed by the hospital system, they were able to, of course, stay. And that still looked, the approach was a little bit different because they were able to be with that patient the entire time. It was really where we ran into the volunteer aspect. And honestly, we had a lot of conversations with programs that had volunteers that were not at a point where they felt comfortable enough to go into the setting, which we absolutely understood and supported.
Yeah. So a lot of it sounds like the biggest thing, a lot of creative responses I've heard in my scan of work, everything from providing a written letter to, like you said, FaceTime, a program that would fax over a picture. So at least, you know, then if you got on the call, but it sounds like that's really being designed between that program and that advocacy agency based on where they were even before COVID, right? And their capacity and resources, and then what's going to fit for them. And then hopefully a coordinated form of inquiry and support for whatever the patient actually feels like will fit for them. Yeah, great. I also know you've done some strong policy work, and I want to come back to that in a little bit. So be thinking a little bit about that because that really gets at to the systemic kinds of reforms and work that's important. So thank you. Excuse me a second. So Steve, I'd like to come to you now and bring us back to a local community response. You're a deputy chief in a police department in Salem, the capital city in Oregon. I think you mentioned that, with around 173,000 people. You have a lot of experience both as an investigator and as a police administrator, and also as a trainer, working both around Oregon and nationally. So what changed in your department's response to sexual violence due to the pandemic, and sort of at the beginning, and where are you at now? And maybe how does that compare to other departments that you've seen?
Well, one of the things that we found, and similar to Sara, is we still have a job to do. We still have to go and respond to people in need. And so we made some changes, but we sat down with some of our officers and our detectives, and overwhelmingly they said we still need to respond to these calls. And so we still do in-person calls. Things that have changed a little bit is when we respond on these calls, we don't always go inside the person's house. If we can avoid it, we ask them to come out so we can talk to them outside. Because not only do our officers have concerns about going into someone's house, but sometimes people have concerns about where we've been, who we've come in contact, and maybe don't necessarily want us inside their house. So we try and be respectful of that, and offer alternative places to meet if they want to meet us outside, if they want to meet us at some public place or somewhere else where we can take that report. But we still try and talk to the victims. We respond to the hospitals to do those calls. We won't necessarily go in the exam room and things like that, but the hospitals have set up a safe place for us to meet with victims, and so that we can talk to that face-to-face contact. Still, for a person that is just experienced a very traumatic event, and being able to talk to someone that they know is safe and that is there to help them really goes a long way, and we understand the importance of that, and we'll still try and emphasize and do that as much as we possibly can. So it's just a focus for us, knowing that the community counts on us, and we need to be there and be responsive for them.
Yeah, excellent. I know that you have even like many departments in terms of felony sexual assault cases, there's a patrol response, right? And taking some of that initial information, assessing things, and then there's often passed on to a detective for follow-up or more in-depth interviews. Is that still happening?
Yeah, so we did a couple of different things. We want our officers to, we want them to promote, we want them to advance, we want them to be investigators themselves, you know, aspire to be a detective or an investigator. And so several years ago, we sat down and we looked at our crimes. And so one of the things almost every agency, at least in the United States, has, a number of years ago, Mothers Against Drunk Driving formed, and they had this grassroots push for the investigation and prosecution of drunk driving cases. And so in almost every state, usually the state police or someone like that took the lead, and they created a standardized investigation. These are the questions you ask, these are the tests you do, and if you do these things, and I'm just making up these numbers off the top of my head, but if you follow this process, you have a 90% chance of your case being prosecuted, and you have a 92% chance of being successful in that prosecution because you're doing it the same way every time, you're doing the same thing, and you have consistency. So what we did is we created a checklist for our officers. We sat down with advocates, prosecutors, our DV officers, and said, in a perfect world, if you could ask all these questions, what questions would you ask? So we ask about child abuse, we ask about animal abuse, we ask about strangulation, we ask about stalking, we ask about all of those things, so that our officers in their initial investigation provide the information that a prosecutor needs to prosecute that case. We also, as Sandie mentioned earlier, we tell them to ask about history of these calls. So we know these offenders, that it's a course of conduct for them. They're doing this over and over again, and there are more crimes than just that crime that you have been dispatched on to investigate there. So we do all of those things, and then if the officers find in there that there is history, there's more victims, those kinds of things, then we'll bring in a detective for follow-up to follow up that case, and meet with the victim and continue that investigation.
Yeah, great. Context being so important, right? So kind of as much context you can get at the early stages to guide what's next. Excellent.
Absolutely.
I know the other thing we talked about when we were preparing is, I thought was quite interesting, was the awareness you all had that because so many courts were going on, were kind of delaying things, right? And pausing, that really had an impact on survivors. Already many places in the US, sexual assault cases take a long time to move through the system, and that has a lot of implications for survivors. And so now I'm aware that in many places it's courtroom to courtroom deciding, handling it differently, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some places might be more uniform than that, but you talked about an awareness of that and having your officers sort of pay extra attention or stay involved quite a bit longer just to check in on the survivor with what was happening. Did I get that right, or do you want to say anything more about that?
So we do. When we arrest an offender for a person's crime, and if they are released from jail, they have a no contact order. And so that's an arrestable offense if they violate that order. So we encourage our officers, and they have become very good at that, to go back and check in with the victim. If we find the offender there at the house, then we arrest them a second time. We found that the folks at the jail are not very understanding with people that violated the agreement that they made with them. And they're very much less likely to release them a second time because they gave them the one chance and they failed at Most states, or a lot of the states, have Vine or some other notification type that will let victims know when the offender is released. We encourage our officers to sign up for Vine as well. If that you have this offender that has caused problems in the community, we should know when he's back in our community and start paying attention to him again, and knowing if he's trying to contact the victim, because we know that these people engage in stalking behavior, and it's all about power and control. And so it's up to us to exert more power and control over them than they are over the victim.
Right. Yeah. So recognizing that crime event that maybe resulted in the initial disclosure isn't likely the whole story in any way, right? That there's context at the beginning, and then as the process takes a while, there's likely some things happening.
Absolutely. And again, keep in mind, these offenders that we're dealing with, it's about power and control. These are the folks with the mindset of the rules don't apply to me. I can do whatever I want. I can make you do whatever I want. It's all about me. And so when we look at crime overall, look at your drug dealers, look at your bank robbers, look at your car thieves. They're all coming from these domestic violence homes where they learned the rules just don't apply to me. You can do whatever you want. And so those are the folks that they're causing multiple problems in our community, not just these assaults. You'll find out that they're committing other crimes as well.
Yeah, so you've prioritized that. You know, I can see that we have a number of questions coming for you. So we'll move there, and also probably for Sara, we'll move there and check in. Real quickly though, you talked a few times about how you've basically coordinated with other agencies and coming up with a checklist, and undoubtedly reviewing. I know you work extensively with advocates. I also know you're part of a sexual assault response team, or your agency is. Can you say anything more about how that has impacted both, I know that this is so short, but how that's impacted sort of coming up with these strategies, as well as any particular elements of adapting during COVID-19. We talked about Sandie, for example, having these conversations before COVID hit, right? Which allows you to sort of pick it up. Have you found that helpful as well?
So we, in Oregon, a number of years ago, passed a law that every county in Oregon has to have a sexual assault response team. There are folks that it's like, oh my gosh, it's another meeting to go to every month. And I just can't stress enough the importance of those meetings. Even if you don't have a case to review, the fact that you get everybody together in the room, I figure out what your role is. We build that trust, because trying to build that trust and that communication when that big case hits and there's all this publicity, it's not going to happen then. So having those meetings on a regular basis to talk about what I can do, knowing, for law enforcement, knowing what your advocates what services can they offer? What if I've got a victim that has pets and won't leave if they have pets? What if I have a victim that has a 13-year-old son, so they can't go into shelter? That son can't accompany. So figuring those things out and having those conversations early on, regularly, and knowing that, and building that trust and that confidence in your partner is so critical. And I just can't stress enough. I know it's another meeting. I know we all have way too many meetings, but these are so valuable in having them on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It sounds like that's both where you work out the granular stuff, like those specific instances that often may be places that are beyond sort of what officers have been trained in, right? Because they're community issues. But sure, by the same token, a chance to work out some policy stuff. How might we be handling, this issue going forward, right? Access to interpreters, or notification of release, those kinds of things. It allows both.
Can I just come in there as well? Just, and I think one other thing that we've seen as well is also then about messaging, so then we're messaging and they're saying, look, what are you seeing? We've seen numbers down, this is what we're seeing. And so one of the messages, for example, is where people had been raped or sexually assaulted, if they had been sort of breaking lockdown, if you like, if they were maybe somewhere that they shouldn't, and for us to then be able to message out through all of our social media and our contact with survivors that actually the police, you are not going to get into trouble for this bit. They're really the public protection side of it, and the sexual violence is the bit that they're interested in. So I think even on a kind of more strategic communications sort of strategy, that communication work with our partners has been really vital, I think.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Sandie, because I think we haven't touched on it extensively here, but we did in pre-meetings about numbers going down, survivors may be feeling like those services weren't there. And I know a number of disciplines have said, and localized agencies, hey, we just even had governors, at least in the US, as part of their daily briefings say, hey, services are open, people are there for you. You don't need to stay in an unsafe home in terms of that aspect of things, but there are people who are ready to respond. So that shared and consistent messaging is so key. And I think Steve spoke to too, knowing what the other agency is going to do, right? What you can expect from each other. Well, thank you all. This is so rich. Laura, I want to turn back to you. Maybe you can guide us through some questions. I know the questions have been pouring in.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, we have a number of questions specifically for Steve and then some for other panelists as well. So we'll stick with Steve for a minute here. Steve, one question is coming from a former police officer in Ireland asking if if law enforcement is facing challenges or attention due to the criminal justice system's focus on convictions, and whether that's opposed or in tension with having a justice-focused response for survivors.
You're going to make me pull out my soapbox here, so to climb up on it. It's one of the challenges when I do training for law enforcement, for prosecutors. It's take the ego out of these investigations. We talk about them as my this is not your investigation. It's not your case. This is a victim. It's about them. And so you need to not worry about your solve rate, not worry about your conviction rate. Listen to what the victim is telling you and take the ego part out of that. We get wrapped up in these numbers and those kinds of things. And so sitting down, talking with the victim, and what is a positive outcome out of this case for you? And if you're working in this field, you've heard it from victims. I want it to stop. I don't want him to do this anymore. I want, a lot of victims really don't care about the criminal conviction. They care about stopping and being vindicated that what happened to them is wrong. And so just listening to those things, and Sandie may want to chime in here on things that she's heard too from victims, but yeah, conviction rate is not a good measure of justice.
Okay. Sandie, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Just, I mean, one of the key things when I'm doing training with the police officers, I'm like, one of the key things that comes back about what makes a difference is just the approach, the human approach of the officer, even where it isn't being taken forward. One woman I spoke to recently, the fact that the senior officer has sat her down and said, I believe you, that was just so powerful. So, and she said, that will be the thing that if I ever need them again, I will go back, because I know that they were compassionate, they were thoughtful, they were human. It's a really small attention to detail that doesn't cost anything, but is just about warmth and connection and understanding that someone is traumatized, regardless or not. And a bit like you said, Jessica, about what is justice, feeling like you were treated well and humanely and with compassion, I think can be, yeah, is powerful and is cheap, that's a resourcing issue. That is there's no excuse for that not to be there, but just someone saying, I believe you, was just the most transformative thing for her.
Thank you. And this question is in some ways connected, but also kind of a more logistical, practical question. It comes from a colleague of yours in Oregon. as many advocacy centers have shut down their emergency shelters and maybe are using hotels for one-day stays, for example, or there's just reduced advocacy, how has this impacted law enforcement?
Yeah, there is a challenge right now for victims wanting to leave. And it's a challenge even in the best of times, but at this point in time, you want to leave your offender. Where do you find 5 people with a pickup to be able to move you? How do you go look for a new apartment? Do all of those things, especially if you have children. There's no school, there's no childcare. All of those kinds of things are such a big challenge for victims. So, you know, talking to our advocacy center, they are going through hotel vouchers at the highest rate they've ever gone through, and they can't really advertise that to say we're running out of hotel vouchers, because if they make that public, then the offenders are going to start driving through hotel parking lots looking for their victims and things like that. So we're in a really tough spot. But you know, just encouraging like we talked about earlier, encouraging our officers to hold these offenders accountable, to look at the history, find as many crimes to charge the offender with as they can, and get them held in jail for a longer period of time is what's going to be impactful. And then staying on top of that and making sure that offender doesn't go back on the victim.
Okay, and I have kind of one more question that I think probably any panelist can talk to before we kind of move on to talking about what's next in your work as we kind of move forward to opening economies and states opening back up. So can you talk a little bit more about what, if any, services in your field have been digitized and what you're doing to document these practices for further analysis, whether they're working, whether there are things that you want to keep, things like that. Would anyone like to speak to that?
Well, for us, you know, I talked about our checklist. We've been doing that for several years now. Our prosecution rate went from the mid 50% to, I think last year we were at 86% prosecution rate. When you provide the prosecutors the information that they need, the history, all of those kinds of things, we've seen that works. That's been proven to work. And so we've continued to do that. So that's one of the things that we have done and will continue to do.
Laura, I have sort of a couple of thoughts. And one thing, this isn't quite about digitizing, but I think it's important to also hold on to that there have been kind of a few benefits of the ways in which we've all pivoted to working remotely. So for example, for many survivors, for safety, for privacy, because of childcare or transportation issues, the fact that courts are allowing survivors to appear remotely also has its benefits, right? They may be able to do that from a co-located service or from their home. Particularly in many communities, public transportation has been cut back due to COVID-19 and also related budget cuts. So that's created, of course, another challenge, and not having to go to the courthouse can benefit survivors. I know certainly in many communities, civil protection orders are being done remotely in a more survivor-centered way than in some states. I know for some of our undocumented survivor clients who are not legally present in the United States, not having to go to the courthouse or have witnesses or family members reduces the risk that they might be picked up. Even though ICE isn't supposed to be in courthouses, they sometimes are. And I think this really cuts both ways in terms of accessibility for survivors. there are some ways in which using electronic communications can enhance access for perhaps, survivors who might be deaf or hard of hearing or have mobility issues. But there are also lots of ways in which it can just exacerbate it and make it so much more difficult. So I just think being mindful, particularly for communities of survivors with disabilities, it depending sort of what the disability is and also what options are available that can be a benefit and or it can be a burden.
Thank you. Those are great points. Yeah.
I think do you want any, just in terms of the sort of digital movement, we've definitely seen, Scotland's got 92 inhabited islands. We've got quite a few of the centres that specifically service very remote island communities. And I think just people's growing comfort, for a lot of people, the growing comfort in participating in events like this, we've seen much higher levels of engagement from other centres. And I think if you have the voices of communities who are on the margins, literally they are in islands out on the middle of nowhere, some of them, I think that helps inform the whole. So I think that participation, whilst there's an increased marginalisation in some groups, I think for others we've definitely seen more participation and engagement. And I think also, it's early days, I think we definitely, it is a kind of ongoing reviewing, but one of the things that we've introduced, I think it was a few years ago, where the number of phone calls versus texts more generally, sort of text overtook phone in terms of the main method of communication. We have thousands of hang-ups every year and hundreds of silent calls, and I think it speaks to the challenge in making those first steps. We've introduced text quite recently and have had quite a really positive uptake, because it's so much easier to send a one line of text, even just saying, I'm not sure where to start, than it is to use your voice. And also we introduce it like, this is Rape Crisis Scotland, so you're hearing rape as soon as you pick up the phone. Whereas I think it's early days, and I think it will be useful to look at, well, who's using it and how is it being used and what are the implications. But it's definitely interesting to see with these adaptions about who is able to engage in a way that they maybe weren't, particularly younger people in this particular context. But yeah, I think it's interesting times.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're both speaking to some things that are maybe places of adaptation that have actually been creative and potentially beneficial. I'd like to sort of move now to thinking about what's next and just pose that question of, for all of you, is there something that you would like to see maybe carried forward? And conversely, is there anything that you're particularly concerned about or you think should be on people's radars as we continue to move forward, even without a vaccine for COVID, and what should be top of mind? And maybe I'll start with you, Sara.
Sure. Thinking about this, and it's something that I think that we all need to collectively think about each day. With this particular patient population, we, even not during a pandemic, we need to be thinking creatively about how we can provide access to these patients. What is meeting them where they are? So, historically, that's been in a hospital setting. Is that really what's best for the patient? Are we meeting them where they are and meeting their needs? And are we being creative with that? So really thinking outside of the box of what is most helpful for them, and long-term, with the many healthcare implications that come along with victims of violence, how can we help mitigate some of those concerns? So being creative. Does that mean moving our services outside of the emergency department? We really haven't talked specifically about medical telehealth, but from a forensic perspective, long-term, what does that look like? Does that look like the forensic nurse getting a history from a patient over the phone when there physically is no possible way to actually have them come to the hospital for the forensic exam? So being creative and looking at other options and staying on top of those options, I think, is very important.
Yeah, thanks, Sara. And before we move, one of the things I think that has gotten some attention even before COVID, but I know got some stronger reference because of the nature of COVID, may still be going forward, I think just is worth a mention, and that is the private vendors who are promoting at-home rape kits, forensic exam, that kit that survivor could do for themselves and send in. And there seems to be pretty uniform consensus, at least in the US, that among responders, that that's highly problematic. And I know IFN has issued some guidance. Can you just say a few things about why you see that as so concerning?
Sure, and just to elaborate a little bit, so the physical evidence recovery kit or the rape kit, there are several private entity vendors that have created a kit that a patient could essentially collect themselves at home. And while, you know, that is something that's new and a lot of people have that as a thought of something that may be a solution to this problem, the IAFN does not see that as the best possible resource for this patient population. In our opinion, the kit itself is a very small component to the forensic exam. We really want to treat the patient holistically and meet a myriad of many different medical complaints that could be presented. It's more than just collecting the physical evidence. There are a number of things that are addressed during that medical forensic exam. So it also could pose a problem with putting the patient at risk, a safety concern. If they're collecting it at home and the potential abuser is still within the home, that's putting the patient in a significant area of risk. So we do not advocate for the at-home kits. We really are a huge advocate for finding the medical care that fits the patient's needs. That may be telehealth, but it's not going to be an at-home kit. It may be telehealth for the perspective of making sure that the patient has access to pregnancy prophylaxis or STD prophylaxis or follow up with a mental health professional. Those are the things that we want to make sure that we're addressing. And at this time, the kit itself is not what we are advocating for the patient to do at home.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. I don't know if other people in other countries are seeing that, but I know that the forensic medical response, even in the US, varies widely depending on if you have access to trained forensic medical folks, if some rural areas don't, but particularly abroad or outside the US, that may also be scattered, and I thought it was really important to bring that up. So thanks for addressing that.
Yeah, and if I could just jump
Steve.
in there, just for me, that's a nightmare. I mean, my goal in investigating a case is that I'm going to do a strong enough investigation that that victim would never have to get on the stand and testify. But if I've got a victim that is collecting evidence and they're, you know, a defense attorney is not going to pass up an opportunity to get that victim on the stand and question her about collecting the evidence and doing all that kind of stuff, and they're going to be re-victimized again. So for law enforcement, that's just a nightmare of chain of custody, chain of evidence, all that kind of stuff. So really, really not a good idea.
Thanks, Steve. And it may well be that I saw some statistic recently that only 10 out of 100 survivors reach out to advocacy for help even. And so back to our theme of coordinated information and getting information out there, which we don't have sort of time to go into all now, but it may well be that part of the response is services are available, all the protections that you can get an exam without reporting to the police in the US, right? But that getting it done well in the way we know it, it preserves options that an at-home kit would not. So so those are probably some places we can continue to try and do the piece that you've all spoken about so well, is really sort of get the message out that services are there and they're available. So we just have a few minutes left. I want to make sure that others have a chance to weigh in on what's top of mind. And we talked a little bit about what you hope to carry forward in the future, but Steve, let me go to you since you were just speaking. And is there anything else that's sort of top of mind for you?
Yeah, my biggest concern is when we do move forward and we're out of COVID, victims that have been cooped up with these offenders for so long, their first thought is going to be, I need to leave this offender. And we all know that is the time that a victim is at the biggest risk. the biggest risk for violence. And my concern is seeing a big uptick in very violent cases of victims trying to leave and offenders realizing they're losing control over the victim and trying to gain that control back. So I think we need to prepare for that. We need to have resources in place for victims to get away safely, and have those resources in place, knowing that victims are going to want to make that move.
Oh, great. Thanks, Steve. Josie, can I come to you?
Sure. I'm going to piggyback on Steve's comments that one of the things that we saw happen here in the United States as the pandemic set in, my understanding is a real surge in the number of firearms, guns being purchased, which, you know, inevitably we know who's harmed by that. Disproportionately, it's going to be survivors, it's going to be people of color, and LGBTQ, trans survivors. So I just have tremendous fear about what it's going to look like in that sort of increased lethality risk period. The other major concern I have is that all across the US, states are implementing contact tracing practices, so that if somebody does test positive, you know, they ask them, well, who else have you been in contact with, and start contacting in turn those people. In some states, providing that information is mandatory. In other states, it's optional. And there's just, it's a whole can of worms in terms of privacy and safety for survivors. And that I think we're preparing some FAQs at the Victim Rights Law Center that we'll be sharing with the field, but doing our best effort to get out in front of that, I think, is absolutely urgent.
Yeah, great. That's upon us, right? As more cases, as opening up happens, and in many places, the numbers are increasing too. So we know that strategy is going to be at play. So thanks in advance for the guidance that you'll be sharing through VRLC. Sandie, can I turn to you? Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're flagging already the backlog. I mean, the sort of people have raised that maybe the numbers are down. I think we're expecting that once lockdown is finished, there will be a massive renewal, both in terms of demand for support and in terms of reporting. So the need for advocacy and the need support will be significant. Court delays in Scotland are already sort of 18 months to 2 years before you might get to court. They're predicting it might be anything up to 4 years, which is just unacceptable. And so we need to think in innovative ways about how we can do something different about that. So it's how do we make the justice system fit for purpose, given there's been this unprecedented situation, in a way that is survivor-centered? How do we make sure survivors have got the support that they need and the justice system? And that maybe needs to, you know, needs some quite radical solutions, and it needs some leadership in terms of testing new ways of doing things. The current system needs some quite significant changes anyway, so maybe there is an opportunity that comes within this to do things differently.
That's fantastic, Sandie. One of the pieces I've heard I would lift up in that moment, I think it will be hopefully incumbent upon all of us to also make sure that survivors don't feel, and the system doesn't feel, that if somebody chose not to get an evidentiary exam during this time, that somehow their case is less worthy or less likely to be fully investigated, right? We know cases have been brought well before we had DNA, the ability to do DNA testing, and they can even in this climate. But as you're talking about, those other constraints and pressures may make that gap even, you know, has potential to make that gap even wider about, hey, we already have enough cases where this kind of evidence is available. Why would we sort of look at the other? And yet that that doesn't really move towards survivor safety or public safety, because sometimes perpetrators well know who's less likely to come forward, right? So, well, thank you all very much. We just rapidly moved out of time. You can tell I'd love to sort of keep talking. You all bring such deep and rich information from your context. I'm going to turn it back to Laura to sort of talk us into closing and moving on to everybody's rest of their day. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm just amazed at how much you were able to cover in this hour and a half, and just so much rich information and ideas, and wonderful questions from the attendees as well. So thank you to you as well. Please feel free to follow up with Global Rights for Women, or if you have other questions for the panelists, feel free to email them to me and I will pass them on. And we also will be following up with the recording and with some resources. So please look to your email to see that coming. Thank you again to everybody.